Beneath your feet, as you walk through St. Peter's Square, lie 2,000 years of silence. What if I told you that the Vatican isn't just built on rock, but on secret Severi? Millions of pilgrims stand above one of the most mysterious archaeological sites on earth, never knowing that beneath the marble floors and golden altars lies a hidden world that challenges everything we think we know about the origins of Christianity in 1939. Beneath the altar of St. Peter's Basilica, workers made a discovery that would shake the Vatican to its core. What they found wasn't just bones, it was a question that threatens the very foundation of Christianity itself. But this story doesn't begin in 1939. It begins nearly 2,000 years earlier in a garden where a man was buried and where the Catholic Church claims he still lies. Before we descend into the darkness below, hit that subscribe button. You'll need all the luck you can get for what we're about to uncover. What if the foundation of the world's most powerful religious institution isn't what they claim it to be? What if the bones beneath St. Peter's Basilica tell a different story than the one carved in stone above? You'll need all the courage you can muster for what we're about to uncover, because some truths once seen cannot be unseen. December 1939. Pope Pius X, 11th had died, and his successor, Pius XII, made a decision that would accidentally unravel one of Christianity's most fundamental beliefs. He wanted his predecessor buried in the traditional papal tomb beneath St. Peter's Basilica, in the sacred grove where popes had rested for centuries. It seemed like a simple request: dig a deeper grave in holy ground. But the moment the workers' shovels broke the floor of the papal crypt, they discovered something impossible. Instead of hitting solid earth, they found empty space, ancient stone, steps, Roman marble. The workers had broken through into what appeared to be an underground street from the time of the Caesars. The foreman immediately called the Vatican authorities. Within hours, the area was cordoned off. The workers sworn to absolute secrecy, and a strange order issued: continue aging, but tell no one what you find. This discovery would lead to the most sensitive archaeological excavation in the history of the Catholic Church, and ultimately 2 questions that the Vatican is still trying to answer today. What they found beneath St. Peter's wasn't just unexpected, it was impossible to explain better. According to every historical record, every tradition, every papal decree, for over 500 years, this space should have been solid earth surrounding tomb of St. Peter. Instead, they had stumbled into what appeared to be an intact Roman necropolis, a city of the dead that had been perfectly preserved beneath the most sacred Christian site on earth. But this raises a crucial question: if there was an entire Roman cemetery beneath St. Peter's Basilica, where exactly was St. Peter buried? Pope Pius I, 12th, faced an impossible decision. He could seal up the discovery, bury it forever, and preserve the faith of millions, or he could authorize an excavation that might prove or disprove the Church's most sacred claim. After months of agonizing deliberation, he chose a third option: a secret excavation conducted by a hand-picked team of archaeologists who would be bound by absolute secrecy until their deaths. The team was unlike anything assembled before. Dr. Ludwig Kaz, a German Monsignor, an archaeologist professor, Enrio Hosi, an expert in early Christian art, Bruno Apollongetti, a specialist in Roman archaeology, and Angelbert Kirschbaum, a Jesuit priest, whose faith would be tested by what they were about to uncover. Each man took an oath that went beyond professional discretion. They swore before God and the Pope that they would never reveal what they found until the Vatican gave explicit permissions. Some of them would take that oath to their graves. The excavation began in the dead-off night, with work conducted only when St. Peter's Basilica was closed to the public. By day, millions of faithful continued to pray above, unaware that beneath their feet the very foundations of their faith were being questioned. What the team discovered in those first weeks would have been enough to satisfy any archaeologist. They found intact Roman tombs, dating the 1st to the 4th centuries, magnificent frescoes depicting both pagan and early Christian imagery, inscriptions in Latin and Greek, told all the stories of wealthy Roman families who had chosen this hillside as their eternal resting place. But as they carefully excavated deeper, following the ancient Roman street known as the Via Cornelia, they began to find something else. Something that would either validate the church's greatest claim or destroy it completely. This possibility becomes more troubling when you realize that what they found first wasn't evidence of St. Peter's presence, it was evidence of his absence. In the spring of 1941, working by candlelight in the narrow space beneath the papal altar, the excavation team uncovered what they initially thought was their greatest discovery. They found what appeared to be a shrine dating to approximately Citaho, 160 AA, wall covered in red plaster with a small niche that could have housed sacred relics. The red wall, as it came to be known, was covered in ancient graffiti, not the casual vandalism of tourists, but desperate prayers carved by early Christians who had risked their lives to come to this place. The archaeologists found hundreds of inscriptions, many invoking the name Peter. Here finally was evidence that early Christians had venerated this spot as the burial place of St. Peter. The red wall appeared to be exactly what the church had always claimed existed, a 2nd century shrine built over the tomb of the first pope. As Dr. Kurzbaum carefully cleaned the ancient graffiti, he began to notice nothing disturbing. The inscriptions weren't just prayers to Peter, mixed among them were invocations to other saints, other martyrs, and most troubling of all, references to pagan gods and goddesses that had nothing to do with Christianity. The red wall wasn't just a Christian shrine. It was a place where multiple religions had come to pray, a spiritual crossroads where the boundaries between Christian and pagan had blurred. Beyond recognition, this discovery would lead to an even more shocking realization. If this was truly Peter's tomb, where was St. Petrus? The excavation team carefully removed centuries of accumulated debris from around the red wall they prepared for the moment that would validate nearly 2 millennia of Christian faith. They were about to uncover the actual burial chamber of St. Peter, the fisherman from Galilee who became the rock upon which Christ built his church. But when they finally cleared away the last oft ancient rubble and broken pottery, they found something that left them speechless. The space beneath the red wall, the place where St. Peter's body should have been lying in sacred repose, was completely empty, not empty as if grave robbers had taken the body, empty as if no one had ever been buried there at all. The team worked frantically, expanding their excavation area, thinking perhaps they had miscalculated the location. They dug carefully around the shrine, sifted through every handful of ancient soil, examined every fragment of bone or pottery. But after months of meticulous searching, the conclusion became unavoidable. There was no tomb beneath the red wall. Dr. Josie, the expert in early Christian art, was the first to voice what they were all thinking. What if the early Christians built Ashran here, not because Peter was buried here, but because they believed he was buried here? What if the entire tradition is based on a mistake? But this raises a crucial question that would haunt the excavation team for the rest of their lives. If the most sacred site in Christianity was built over an empty grave, what did that mean for the church that claimed its authority from Thebans that weren't there? The silence surrounding this discovery suggests something even more troubling. When the team reported their findings to Pope Pius XII, his response was not relief that they had solved an ancient mystery, but something approaching panic. Because if St. Peter wasn't buried beneath St. Peter's Basilica, then the entire foundation of papal authority might be built on sand rather than rock. Pope Pius XII's reaction to the empty grave was swift and decisive. He immediately expanded the excavation team and brought in specialists from across Europe, but with a new mandate: find St. Peter no matter what it takes. The search couldn't end with an empty tomb. Too much depended on finding something, anything that could validate the Church's fundamental claim, but the Pope also did something else. Something had revealed just how dangerous this discovery had become. He created a parallel commission of church officials whose job wasn't to assist the archaeological team, but to monitor them. Every photograph taken underground required approval. Every written report was subject to review. Every team member was watched to ensure that no word of the empty grave reassured the outside world. The Vatican had transformed from patron of the excavation into its censor, and this shift revealed something troubling about the nature of the search. It was no longer about discovering the truth, but about finding evidence that supported what the Church needed to be true. D'Art Cass, the German man senior leading the excavation, began to express doubts in his private correspondence. In a letter that wouldn't be discovered until decades later, he wrote, "We came here seeking St. Peter. I fear we may have found something far more disturbing: the absence of St. Peter and the presence of a faith that has built itself on that absence." What they found next would challenge everything the Christian world believed about its most sacred site, but it would also reveal just how far the Vatican was willing to go to protect its deepest secrets. This possibility becomes more troubling and we consider what happened to the original photographic record of the excavation. Of the hundreds of photographs taken during the dig, only a handful were ever made public. The rest disappeared into Vatican's secret archives, where they remain classified to this day. By 1942, the excavation had expanded far beyond the original site. Beneath the papal altar, the team was now exploring an entire underground necropolis, a romancity of the dead that stretched beneath much of St. Peter's Basilica, and it was in a small, unremarkable tomb about 50 meters from the Red Wall that they made a discovery that would either save the Church's claim or make its deception relevant more apparent. Margherita Guarducci, the only woman allowed to join the excavation team, was examining inscriptions in what appeared to be just another Roman family tomb when she noticed something unusual behind a piece of marble that seemed to have been placed deliberately as a covering. She found a small repository containing what appeared to be human remains. But these weren't just any bones. Wrapped around them was a fragment of purple cloth, the color reserved for Roman emperors and later for the most sacred Christian relics, and carved into the marble repository in barely legible Greek letters were words that made Guarducci's heart race. "Peterini Peter is here finally." It seemed they had found St. Peter. The announcement should have been triumphant after 3 years of searching. After the disappointment of the empty grave beneath the Red Wall, here was physical proof that St. Peter had indeed been buried. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica, the bones were carefully extracted, blessed by the Pope himself, and prepared for scientific analysis. But this discovery would lead to an even deeper mystery, one that called into question not just where St. Peter was buried, but whether the Church even knew what it was looking for. The scientific analysis of the bones found in Margherita Guarducci's the repository began with great optimism. Here, finally, was the physical evidence that would validate centuries of Christian tradition. The Vatican's best experts were assembled to examine what were believed to be the remains of the first Pope. Dr. Corey, the anthropologist tasked to study the bones, began his analysis, expecting to find the remains a middle-aged Jewish fisherman from the 1st century. What he found instead sent shockwaves through the Vatican hierarchy. The bones belonged to multiple individuals. Some were clearly from the 1st or 2nd century, which aligned with when St. Peter would have died. Others were much more recent, dating to medieval times. More disturbing still, some of the bones were unmistakably female. Corey's report, which wouldn't be made public for decades, contained conclusion shed. The Vatican found impossible to accept the skeletal remains show evidence of at least 3 different gritty individuals spanning over a millennium. Among these remains are bones that can only belong to a woman of approximately 60 years of age. How could the bones of St. Peter include these remains of a woman? The Vatican's response was swift and revealing. Corey was thanked for his service and quietly removed from the project. His report was classified, and a new team of experts was brought in with instructions to conduct a more thorough analysis. But this raises a crucial question that Church has never satisfactorily answered. If the Vatican was these were the bones of St. Peter, why did they suppress the first scientific analysis, and why were Church officials more interested in managing the evidence than in understanding it? The implications extend far beyond a simple case of mistaken identity, because what Dr. Kerr had discovered suggested something far more troubling, that the bones in the repository weren't ancient remains that had been disturbed, but a collection assembled much later, possibly to provide physical proof for a tradition that lacked historical evidence. The second team of experts brought in to analyze the bones was led by Dr. Antonio Fua, a Jesuit archaeologist whose loyalty to the Church was unquestioned. His mandate was clear: find a way to authenticate these remains as belonging to St. Peter, regardless of the earlier analysis. Dr. Farrohar's team employed more sophisticated dating techniques, early forms of carbon dating, but instead of resolving the mystery, their analysis deepened it. The bones showed dates ranging from the 1st century to the 14th century. Some fragments appeared to be genuinely ancient, possibly from the time of St. Peter. Others were clearly medieval additions, but the most disturbing discovery came when the team examined the fabric found with the bones. The purple cloth that Margaret Agadu had identified as evidence of the bones' sacred nature was subjected to chemical analysis. The results were devastating. The cloth dated to no earlier than the 6th century, nearly 500 years after St. Peter's death. Dr. Farrohar found himself in an impossible position. His scientific training told him that these remains were a collection assembled over many centuries, not the intact burial of a 1st century martyr, but his oath of loyalty to the Church demanded that he find a way to validate them as authentic. His solution was as ingenious as it was troubling. In his official report, Dr. Farua focusedly on the oldest bone fragments, ignoring the medieval additions and the anachronistic fabric. He concluded that while the repository contained later additions, the core remains could plausibly belong to St. Peter. This possibility becomes more troubling when we consider what happened. The scientists who questioned these conclusions, Dr. Corey, was not only removed from the project, but found his career at Catholic institutions effectively ended. Other researchers who raised questions about the dating discrepancies were quietly transferred to other assignments. The evidence that kept changing wasn't the bones themselves, it was the interpretation of what the bones meant, shaped by the Church's need for a particular conclusion rather than scientific truth. As the excavation entered its 4th year, something strange began happening. The official record photographs that had been carefully catalogued began disappearing from the Vatican archives. Field notes kept by team members were lost or misfiled. Most disturbing of all, some team members began to distance themselves from their earlier conclusions. Dr. Bruno Apolongetti, who had been among the most enthusiastic supporters of the excavation, suddenly began expressing doubts about their findings in private conversations. He suggested that the team might have been to a find evidence of St. Peter's presence, but when pressed for details he wouldn't say that certain administrative decisions had been made that affected how the evidence should be interpreted. Margherita Garducci, who had discovered the bone repository, found herself increasingly isolated from the rest. Oft-time, her requests to examine other areas of the necropolis were denied. Her access to the photographic record was restricted, and when she attempted to publish preliminary findings about the Greek inscription, Peter Enishi was told fatal publications required approval from a Vatican committee that never seemed to meet the missing documentation wasn't limited to contemporary records. Her team had also been tasked with cataloguing historical references to St. Peter's burial site, but they discovered that many medieval documents that should have mentioned the tomb were either missing from Vatican libraries or had sections that appeared to have been deliberately removed. Dr. Kurzbaum, the Jesuit priest on Thetim, wrote in his private journal, "We began this excavation, seeking truth. I fear we have become participants in its concealment. The question is no longer what we found beneath St. Peter's, but what we have been instructed to stop looking for." Team members who later recanted their statements didn't do so because new evidence had emerged. They did so because they had been made to understand that certain conclusions were acceptable to the Church and others were not. The excavation had become less about archaeology and more about managing a narrative that the Vatican could not afford to lose. By 1950, the excavation had been ongoing for over a decade, and pressure was mounting on the Vatican to make some kind of public announcement. Rumors were circulating in archaeological circles about the dig beneath St. Peter's. Questions were being asked about why the Church was being so secretive about what should have been the greatest archaeological discovery in Christian history. Pope Pius XII decided to make a carefully worded announcement that acknowledged the excavation while revealing as little as possible about its findings. He confirmed that work had been done beneath St. Peter's Basilica and that interesting discoveries had been made, but he stopped short of claiming that St. Peter's tomb had been found. This cautious approach might have been the end of the matter, but Pi XII died in 1958, and his successor, Pope John I, 23rd, faced different pressures. The Second Vatican Council had opened the Church to greater transparency, and there were calls for the Vatican to share its archaeological findings with the broader scientific community. Was Pope Paul VI, elected in 1963, who made the decision that would forever change how the world understood the excavation beneath St. Peter's on June 26, 1968. In a dramatic announcement to a packed St. Peter's Square, Paul V declared that the bones of St. Peter had been definitively identified and were indeed resting beneath the Basilica. The relics of St. Peter have been identified in a manner which we believe convincing the Pope. An unseated crowd erupted in celebration. Headlines around the world proclaimeth that modern science had validated ancient faith, but the archaeological community's reaction was very different. Dr. Margherita Garducci, who had been excluded from the final analysis, publicly questioned the Pope's conclusions. Dr. Antonio Ferrua, who had led the second examination of the bones, stated that while the remains could belong to St. Peter, there was no definitive proof. Most tellingly, several members of the original excavation team remained conspicuously silent about the Pope's announcement. Why was the 1968 announcement made despite conflicting evidence? The answer lies not in what the excavation had discovered, but in what the Church needed to be true. By 1968, the Vatican was facing challenges from biblical scholars who were questioning many traditional Catholic teachings. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls raised new questions about the origins of Christianity. The Church needed a victory, a piece of hard evidence that could shore up its authority. The Paul V Sixth Proclamation wasn't based in new archaeological evidence, it was based on a decision that the existing evidence, however ambiguous, would be interpreted in the way that best served the Church's needs. To understand how the excavation beneath St. Peter's Basilica became so controversial, we must go back nearly 1700 years to Thiamont, when Christianity transformed from a persecuted minority religion into the official faith of the Roman Empire, because the story of St. Peter's burial site begins not with Peter himself, but with Emperor Constantine and a political decision that would reshape Christianity forever. In 312 A.B., Constantine won Thibatal of the Milvian Bridge and attributed his victory to the Christian god weather. His conversion was genuine or strategic is still debated, but its consequences were immediate and profound. Within a decade, Constantine had not only legalized Christianity, but had begun an ambitious program of church construction that would establish the physical foundations of the faith. One of Constantine's most ambitious projects was the construction of a basilica over what was claimed to be the burial site of St. Peter. But here's where the story becomes troubling. There is no contemporary evidence that Christians in the early 4th century knew where St. Peter was buried. The tradition placing his death and burial in Rome dates to much later sources, and even those sources disagree about the specific location. Constantine chose to build his basilica in Vatican Hill, a location that required massive engineering efforts. The hillside to be cut away. Ancient Roman tombs had to be destroyed, and the entire area had to be leveled. Why would Constantine undertake such an expensive and technically challenging project, unless he was certain that St. Peter was buried there? The answer is as shrewd as it is theologically problematic. Constantine needed St. Peter to be buried in Rome, regardless of whether he actually was. By building a magnificent basilica over claimed burial site, Constantine wasn't just honoring a saint, he wasted Rome as the undisputed center of Christianity, with himself as its protector. This discovery would lead to an even more troubling realization. The tradition of St. Peter's burial in Rome was created by Constantine for political reasons. Then the entire foundation of papal authority might be built on a 4th century power grab rather than a 1st century divine mandate. Legends that became history weren't preserved memories of actual events, they were narratives created to serve the political and religious needs of a particular moment, then repeated so often that they became indistinguishable from truth. Before Constantine's basilica buried, the Vatican became the center of Christianity. Vatican Hill was something different. The site of Nero's circus, one of the most notorious locations in ancient Rome. This was where Christians were martyred for entertainment, where St. Peter himself was supposedly crucified upside down sometime around 64, but what the 1940s excavation revealed about the pre-Constantian history of Vatican Hill calls into question everything we thought we knew about the early Christian presence there, because at it lay beneath the Vatican was an evidence of Christian veneration of St. Peter's burial site, was evidence of something far more complex and troubling. The Roman necropolis discovered beneath St. Peter's Basilica was a pagan burial ground filled with tombs dedicated to Roman gods and goddesses. The families buried there were wealthy Romans, who chose this location not because of any Christian significance, but because it was a prestigious burial site with beautiful views over the Tiber River. Among the pagan tombs, the excavation team found scattered evidence of early Christian burials. But these were clearly later additions, Christians who wanted to be buried near where they believed St. Peter lay. The problem is that the Christian burial state to the 3rd and 4th centuries, long after St. Peter's supposed death in 64 AD, more troubling. Still, the excavation revealed that the area had been thoroughly disturbed. Multiple times before Constantine's construction project, grave robbing was common in ancient Rome, and Vatican Hill showed clear evidence of systematic tomb raiding over several centuries. If St. Peter had been buried there, his remains would likely have been scattered or stolen long before. Constantine decided to build a basilica. Blood-soaked earth that became holy ground tells a story not of Christian triumph, but of Christian mythology grafted onto a pagan landscape. The Vatican was built not over the ascertained burial place of St. Peter, but over a hillside where Romans had been burying their dead for centuries, and where Christians eventually came to believe, or chose to believe, that their most important saint was buried. One of the most powerful symbols of papal authority is the fisherman's ring Warrenby. Every pope since at least the 13th century, the ring bears an image of St. Peter in a boat casting his nets and represents the pope's role as the successor to Pettoth fisherman, but the symbol of the fisherman that predates Christianity reveals something troubling about how Christian imagery was borrowed from much older traditions. The excavation team beneath St. Peter's found numerous examples of pre-Christian fisherman imagery in the pagan tombs of Vatican Hill. Fish were symbols of abundance and resurrection in several mystery religions that were popular in Rome centuries before Christ's the god Mithras, whose worship was widespread among Roman soldiers, was often depicted with fish symbolism. Even more troubling for Christian claims of uniqueness, the fish was a symbol of fertility and rebirth in the cult of Thegreat Mother Cybele, whose worshippers practiced death and resurrection rituals. That bears striking similarities to Christian sacraments. Dr. Garducci's analysis of the graffiti on the Red Wall revealed that early Christians weren't just praying to St. Peter, they were using symbols and language borrowed directly from these older mystery religions. The inscription Peter Ani that she discovered as evidence of St. Peter's presence was written in the same style and format as pagan invocations found throughout the necropolis. Ancient mystery religions and the Fisher King archetype appear in cultures across the Mediterranean world. From the dying and rising gods of Egypt to the sacred fish kings of Celtic mythology, Christian appropriation of these symbols wasn't unique or divine. It was part of a common pattern of religious syncretism that allowed new faiths to topple to existing believers. But this raises a troubling question. If symbols, stories, and even the locations associated with St. Peter were borrowed from pre-existing pagan traditions, how much of the Christian story is actually Christian, and why won't the Vatican Library allow scholars to research the parallels between Christian and pagan traditions that are preserved in the archaeological record beneath St. Peter's Basilica's question isn't whether Peter was a real person who lived and died in the 1st century. Most historians accept that he was. The question is whether the Peter of Christian tradition bears any resemblance to the historical figure, or whether he has been transformed into something else entirely, a Christian version of much older archetypal figures that helped make the new religion familiar and acceptable to pagan converts. To understand how the bones found beneath St. Peter's Basilica became such a source of controversy, need to examine one of the darkest chapters in medieval church history: the systematic manufacture and trade in false relics, because by the Middle Ages the demand for saints' bones far exceeded the supply, leading to an underground economy, relic production that transformed religious devotion into commercial enterprise. Medieval Europe was obsessed with relics. Every church needed the bones of a saint to consecrate its altar. Every monastery required sacred remains to attract pilgrims and their donations. The problem was mathematical. There were thousands of churches across Europe, but only a limited number of saints who had died and been buried in identifiable locations. The solution was as ingenious as it was blasphemous: the industrial production of saints' remains. Professional relic dealers would scour ancient cemeteries, particularly in Rome, harvesting bones from pagan burials and transforming them into Christian relics through the simple expedient of false documentation and creative storytelling. The process was remarkably systematic. Bone dealers would purchase ancient Roman cemeteries, then sort the remains by age and condition. The best bones, those from older individuals who might plausibly have been martyrs, were reserved for the most important saints. Lesser remains were assigned to minor saints or local martyrs, whose stories were conveniently flexible. The economic empire built on sacred bones was vast and profitable. A finger bone of St. Peter could fund the construction of a cathedral. A fragment of St. Paul's rib could establish the foundation of a monastery. The Vatican was not only aware of this trade, it was actively involved in regulating it, taking a percentage off sales and issuing authenticity certificates that transformed ancient pagan bones into priceless Christian relics. But this raises a troubling question about the bones found beneath St. Peter's Basilica, given the medieval church's ostensive involvement in the relic trade, and given the clear evidence that the bone repository contained remains from multiple time periods. Is it possible that what Margherita Guarducci discovered wasn't the tomb of St. Peter, but a medieval relic cache designed to provide a physical proof of a tradition that lacked historical evidence? Dating discrepancies, the mixed gender of the remains, the anachronistic epic, all of these problems make sense if we understand the bones not as ancient relics, but as medieval constructions designed to validate a claim that the Church needed to be true. One of the most closely guarded secrets of the Vatican excavation is that St. Peter's Basilica isn't the only location in Rome that claims to hold the remains of St. Peter. In fact, there are at least 3 others in the city that have equal or better historical claims to being the true burial place of the first pope. The Church's reluctance to acknowledge these competing claims reveals just how politically important it was for Peter to be buried beneath the Vatican. The Church of San Sebastiano, located on the ancient Ion Way, has maintained since the 3rd century that it holds the true remains of both St. Peter and St. Paul. Unlike the Vatican, San Sebastiano has continuous documentary evidence of its claim, including inscriptions dating to 3rd century that explicitly state here lie Peter and Paul. The church also has the advantage of being located in an area that was actually used for Christian burials in the 1st century, unlike Vatican Hill, which was primarily a pagan necropolis. 7 more troubling for the Vatican's claim is the discovery in the 1950s Ofut appears to be the original burial site of St. Peter in the Jewish cemetery beneath the Church of San Juda Filignami. This site, excavated by a team that included several archaeologists who had worked on the Vatican dig, revealed a 1st century burial that matched historical descriptions of Peter's martyrdom and burial. But this excavation was quickly shut down, and its findings superseded not because the evidence was weak, but because it was too strong. The 3rd competing site is perhaps the most historically plausibly location beneath the Church of Santa Maria in Tersta, in the neighborhood where Christian sources place the house of Pope Linus Peter's immediate successor. Archaeological evidence suggests that this area was the center of Christian activity in 1st century Rome, making it a more likely location for Peter's burial than the distant Vatican Hill. Why did Rome need Peter to be buried at the Vatican? The answer lies in the politics of papal power. The Vatican Hill location allowed the Church to build its headquarters directly over the claimed burial site of its founder, creating a physical and symbolic center of authority that could not be challenged if Peter were buried elsewhere. In Rome, the Bishop of Rome would be just an etherical religious leader. But if Peter were buried beneath the papal residence, then the Pope became the literal inheritor of apostolic authority. The Church's refusal to acknowledge or investigate the competing claims isn't based on archaeological evidence. It's based on the recognition that the wrong answer to the question, "Where is Peter?" buried, could undermine the entire structure of papal authority as the excavation team worked deeper into the Roman necropolis beneath St. Peter's Basilica. They began to notice something that the Vatican would prefer remained hidden: the pervasive presence of solar symbolism throughout the site, not just in the pagan tombs, which might be expected, but integrated into the early Christian imagery in ways that revealed unconfronted truths about the origins of Christian theology. The mosaic of Christ discovered in Onaf, the earliest Christian tombs beneath the Vatican, shows Jesus not as the suffering servant of later Christian art, but as Sol Invictus, the unconquered Son riding a chariot across the heavens. This wasn't an anomaly. Similar solar imagery appeared throughout the Christian sections of the necropolis, suggesting that early Christians, their faith in terms borrowed directly from solar religions. The theological implications are staggering. Sol Invictus was the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century, promoted by emperors who saw sun worshippers a way to unify their diverse empire. The god was born on December 25th. Dedend was reborn and promised salvation to his followers. The parallels to Christianity aren't coincidental, they're foundational. Dr. Kirschbaum's analyses of the Christian inscriptions found beneath St. Peter's Basilica revealed that early Christians regularly used solar terminology to describe Christ Jesus was the Son of Righteousness, the light of the world, the dawn from on high. These weren't metaphors, they were theological statements that placed Christ within an existing solar religious framework. But the most disturbing discovery was architectural. The original Constantinian Basilica was oriented not toward Jerusalem as might be expected, but toward the winter solstice sunrise on December 25th. The sun would rise directly over the altar, illuminating the claimed tomb of St. Peter, with solar symbolism that any worshipper of Sol Invictus would immediately recognize him in him. The mystery religion most popular among Roman soldiers shared so many elements with Christianity that early Christian apologists were forced to claim that demons had created Mithraism as a counterfeit version of Christianity. But the archaeological evidence suggests the opposite. Christianity borrowed extensively from Mithraism, including the December 25th birth date, the dying and rising God narrative, and the promise of salvation through divine sacrifice. The December 25th question that won't go away is this: if Jesus' birth date was unknown to early Christians, and if the December 25th date was chosen to coincide with the birthday of Sol Invictus, what does that tell us? Abutho, much of Christian theology was shaped by the need to appeal to existing pagan believers. And if the answer is most of it, what does that mean for claims about Christianity's unique divine revelation? The most beautiful discoveries in the necropolis beneath St. Peter's Basilica were intricate mosaics featuring peacock symbols that the Church has always claimed represent the resurrection of Christ. But the peacock imagery found beneath the Vatican tells a different story, one that reveals how Christian symbolism was borrowed wholesale from much older traditions. The peacocks in the Vatican necropolis aren't found only in Christian tombs, they appear throughout the pagan burials as well, and they clearly predate the arrival of Christianity in Rome. In ancient mythology, peacocks were Sakureto Hera, the queen of the gods, and were believed to carry souls to the afterlife. bird's ability to shed and regrow its magnificent tail feathers made it a symbol of renewal and resurrection centuries before Christians adopted it. But the peacock symbolism beneath St. Peter's goes deeper than simple borrowing. The mosaics show peacocks drinking from fountains, eating grapes, and surrounding a central figure that could be either Christ or one of several pagan gods associated with death and resurrection. The ambiguity isn't accidental, it reflects a period when the boundaries between Christian and pagan imagery were deliberately blurred to make the new religion acceptable to existing believers. Garducci's analysis of the peacock mosaics revealed something even more troubling. Many of them were clearly pagan in origin, but had been Christianized through the simple addition of Christian symbols or inscriptions. A mosaic of peacocks surrounding Dionysus, Greek god of death and rebirth, had been modified by adding a Q symbol, first two letters of Christ's name in Greek, transforming a pagan resurrection scene into a Christian one. Ancient symbols of resurrection predating Christ appear throughout the Vatican necropolis, not as isolated examples, but as a systematic pattern. The vine and grape imagery, the fish, the shepherd figures, all of these supposedly Christian images existed in pagan contexts for centuries before Christianity emerged. The question isn't whether Christians used these symbols, but whether they understood what they were borrowing. The pagan imagery preserved in Christian art beneath St. Peter's suggests something that the Church has never been willing to acknowledge. Christianity wasn't a revolutionary new religion that emerged fully formed from divine revelation. It was a faith that succeeded by incorporating elements from existing religions, making itself familiar and acceptable to pagan converts, while gradually shifting the meaning of borrowed symbols. But this raises a fundamental question about the nature of Christian truth. If the symbols, story sound, even the locations associated with Christianity were borrowed from pre-existing traditions, how much of the faith is actually unique to Christianity, and what does it mean for claims about divine revelation when the revealed truths turn out to be variations on much older themes? What the Vatican doesn't want you to notice isn't just the presence of pagan imagery in early Christian art. It's the fact that this imagery was so seamlessly integrated that early Christians may not have distinguished between pagan and Christian symbols at all. In the heart of Vatican City stands one of the most enigmatic symbols in Christianity, a massive bronze pine cone over 4 meters tall that dominates the Cortile dell'Arte, the courtyard of the pine cone. Most visitors assume it's simply decorative, but the pinecone's presence at the center of Catholic power reveals something far more troubling about the Church's relationship with pre-Christian spirituality. The Vatican's pinecone isn't Christian in origin, it's Roman, dating to the 2nd century AD, and it originally stood in the temple complex dedicated to Isis, the Egyptian goddess whose mysteries promised death and resurrection to her followers. The pinecone was sacred to Isis because of its association with the pineal gland, which ancient mystery religions believed was the seat of spiritual enlightenment, third eye that allowed initiates to perceive divine truth. But the pinecone's connection to ancient fertility cults goes even deeper. Throughout the Mediterranean world, pine cones were symbols of masculine fertility and regenerative power. The god Dionys carried a staff topped with a pine cone. The followers of Cybele, the great mother, used pine cones in their resurrection rituals. Even the god Mithras, Christianity's primary competitor among Roman soldiers, incorporated pinecone symbolism into his mysteries. When Emperor Constantine moved the pinnacone from the Temple of Isis to his new Christian capital, he wasn't just recycling Roman art. He was transferring the symbolic power of an older religion into the new Christian framework. The pinecone became part of Christian iconography, not because it had any connection to Jesus, or the Apostles' Buckbeck, because it carried with it centuries of accumulated spiritual meaning that made Christianity more familiar and acceptable to pagan converts the third eye. Symbolism that the Church inherited is perhaps the most troubling aspect of the pinecone's presence. In Vatican City, ancient mystery religions taught that spiritual enlightenment came through the activation of the pineal gland represented symbolically. By the pinecone, this inner illumination was believed to allow initiates to perceive hidden truths about the nature of reality and divinity. Christianity, with its emphasis on faith rather than direct spiritual experience, should have rejected this symbolism entirely, but instead the Church preserved its suggesting that early Christian leaders understood the value of incorporating extinct spiritual technologies into their new religion, even if those technologies contradicted Christian theology. The massive pinecone standing in the Vatican today isn't just a piece of ancient art. It's evidence of Christianity's synthetic nature, its willingness to absorb and transform elements from competing religions, rather than replacing them entirely, and its prominent placement at the heart of Catholic power suggests that these pre-Christian elements aren't just historical curiosities. They remain active components of the Church's symbolic vocabulary, standing in the center of St. Peter's Square. Directly in front of the Basilica that claims to house the tomb of Christianity's first pope is a monument that has nothing whatsoever to do with Christianity, a 25 meters tall Egyptian obelisk dedicated the sun god Ra. The obelisk's presence in the heart of Catholic power isn't accidental. It reveals something fundamental about how Christianity established itself by absorbing and transforming the sacred sites and symbols of older religions. The Vatican obelisk was originally erected in Heliopolis, the ancient Egyptian city dedicated to sun worship, around 1835 BC. It stood there for over 1,000 years before being transported to Rome by Emperor Caligula in 37 AD, where it was placed in the center of Nero's circus, the same circus where St. was supposedly martyred when Constantine built his basilica over Peter's claimed burial site. He left the obelisk in place, and it has remained there ever since. But the obelisk's role in ancient sun worship creates a theological problem that the Church has never adequately addressed. The hieroglyphic inscriptions covering the monument are prayers to Ra, the Egyptian sun god, and invocations of divine power associated with solar worship. These aren't just decorative elements, they're active religious statements that continue to proclaim the supremacy of the sun god in the heart of Christianity's most sacred space. When Pope Sixtus V ordered the obelisk moved to its current position in the center of St. Peter's Square in 1586, he performed a blessing ceremony designed to Christianize the monument, but the blessing didn't remove or change the hieroglyphic inscriptions. It implied Christian symbolism on top of pagan content, creating a monument that simultaneously honors both Christ and Ra. The theological implications are staggering. Every day millions of Christians gather in St. Peter's Square for papal audiences and religious ceremonies, participating in worship that takes place around a monument dedicated to a pagan sun god. The irony would be laughable if it weren't so revealing of Christianity's synthetic nature. Why did Christian Rome embrace pagan monuments rather than destroying them? The answer lies in the recognition that symbols carry power independent of their original meaning, and that the Church could harness that power by recontextualizing pagan monuments. Within Christian settings, the obelisk wasn't preserved despite its pagan origins. It was preserved because of them. The Egyptian obelisk at the center of St. Square represents something that the Church would prefer Christians not think about too carefully: the extent to which Christianity succeeded, not by replacing paganism, but by absorbing it. The monument stands as permanent evidence that the most sacred Christian site in the world was built, quite literally, around pagan symbols of sin worship. Deep within Vatican City, beyond the public museums and tourist areas, lies the Vatican secret. Archives officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives in 2019, but still commonly known by its more ominous former title. This repository contains over 80 kilometers of shelving filled with documents spanning nearly 2 millennia of Christian history. But among these documents are texts thatching fundamental Christian beliefs, including materials that call into question the entire Peter narrative. Vatican's secret archives' most guarded documents aren't just political illicit. They're theologically dangerous. Among them are early Christian texts that present radically different versions of Peter's life and death. Versions that locate his martyrdom in Jerusalem rather than Rome, or that suggest he never traveled to Rome at all. These documents have been known to Vatican scholars for centuries, but they've never been made available to outside researchers. Dr. Antonio Martini, a Vatican archivist, worked in the secret archives for over 30 years before his death in 1995, left behind private notes that revealed the extent of the Church's suppression of contradictory evidence. According to Martini's notes, the archives contain at least 12 documents from the 2nd and 3rd centuries that explicitly contradict the Roman tradition of Peter's martyrdom and burial. This include letters from early Christian communities, martyrdom accounts that place Peter's death in other locations, and theological treatises that question whether Peter ever held the kind of supreme authority that later popes claimed to inherit. But perhaps most troubling are the documents that reveal how conscious life Peter tradition was constructed. Martini's notes reference papal letters from the 4th and 5th centuries that discuss the necessity of establishing Peter's presence in Rome for political reasons, regardless of historical evidence. These letters, which remain classified, apparently show church leaders deliberately promoting traditions they knew to be historically questionable because those traditions served the institutional needs of the growing church. The books that challenge the Peter narrative aren't limited to ancient texts. The Vatican Library also contains their search notes and unpublished manuscripts of scholars who have investigated the Peter tradition over centuries. Many of these scholars reached conclusions that contradicted official church teaching, and their work was quietly suppressed. Their manuscripts remain in the Vatican archives, available only to a handful of approved researchers who must agree never to publish findings that contradict Catholic doctrine. The scholars who've disappeared after certain discoveries haven't vanished in any dramatic sense. They've simply found their access to Vatican resources, revoked their academic positions, terminated, and their careers effectively ended. The Church doesn't need to silence scholars through overt persecution when it can achieve the same result through institutional pressure and professional isolation. The Vatican's control over access to these documents reveals something troubling about the relationship between faith and historical truth. The Church claims to welcome scholarly investigation of Christian origins, blatantly, when that investigation reaches conclusions that support established doctrine, when research threatens beliefs like the tradition of Peter's Roman martyrdom and burial acts is restricted and findings are suppressed. After decades of excavation, analysis, and official proclamations, we're left with a question that strikes at the heart of Christian authority. What if Peter never came to Ramoth? Possibility isn't just speculative. It's supported by a growing body of scholarly evidence that the Vatican has spent considerable effort trying to suppress or discredit. The historians who doubt the traditional narrative aren't fringe conspiracy theorists. They're serious scholars working with the earliest available sources. The New Testament itself provides no clear evidence that Peter ever traveled to Rome. The Acts of the Apostles, which chronicles the early spread of Christianity, makes no mention of Peter establishing a church in Rome or being martyred there. Paul's letter to the Romans, written to the Christian community in Rome, doesn't mention Peter at all, a striking omission. Peter was the founder and leader of that community. The earliest clear reference to Peter's Roman martyrdom comes from Clement of Rome, writing around 96 AD. Even Clement's account is vague about the location and circumstances of Peter's death. The detailed stories of Peter's inverted crucifixion in Nero's circus don't appear in written sources until the 2nd century, nearly 100 red years after the supposed events. Even more troubling for the traditional narrative is the lack of any mention of Peter's Roman burial in early Christian sources. If Peter had been buried in Rome, and if his burial site had been known too early, Christians we would expect to find references to pilgrimage, veneration, or at least acknowledgement of his tomb instead. The first clear references to Peter's Roman burial site don't appear until the 4th century, suspiciously close to the time when Constantine was planning his Basilica construction project. How does faith become fact through a petition? The Peter tradition demonstrates the process perfectly. A possibilities gist by one early Christian writer becomes a probability in the next generation, then a certainty in the generation after that. By the 4th century, what had begun as speculation about Peter's possible presence in Rome had hardened into unquestioned dogma about his definite martyrdom and burial there. Their petition wasn't accidental, it served the institutional needs of the Roman Church. If Peter had never come to Rome, then the Bishop of Rome was just another regional Christian leader with no special authority over other bishops. But if Peter had not only come to Rome, but had been martyred there and passed his authority to the local bishop, then the Roman Church could claim supremacy over all other Christian communities. The transformation of speculation into fact reveals something troubling about how religious traditions develop. Truth becomes less important than utility and historical accuracy, become secondary to institutional needs. The question isn't whether early Christians believed Peter had come to Rome, some clearly did. The question is whether that belief was based on historical evidence or on wishful thinking that hardened into tradition through repetition and institutional pressure. The words of Jesus about Petrus, the rock upon which the church would be built, have been used for nearly 2 millennia to justify papal authority. But the Aramaic translation controversy surrounding those words reveals that the entire foundation of Catholic hierarchy might be based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what Jesus actually said. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus tells Peter, "You are the rock, and on this rock I will build my church." In Latin, this became 2 explicit words that appear on the frieze inside St. Peter's Basilica, and that have been used to justify the Pope's supreme authority over all Christians. But the Aramaic words that Jesus would have actually spoken tell a different story. In Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke, there are 2 different words: Kepha, meaning a large rock or stone, and Evna, meaning a small stone or pebble. Most Aramaic scholars believe that Jesus called Peter Kepha, Simon the stone, as something of a joke given Peter's tendency to be stubborn and hard-headed. But when Jesus spoke about the rock on which he would build his church, he likely used Evna, referring not to Peter himself, but to Peter's confession of faith. The distinction matters because it changes the entire meaning of the passage. If Jesus was making a pun calling Patera stone, while saying that the church would be built on the little stone of faith rather than on Peter's personality. The passage isn't about Peter's special authority at all, it's about thempotence of faith, confession over individual leadership. The Greek translation of Matthew's Gospel, written decades after Jesus' death, loses this Aramaic word play entirely. Greek has only one word for rock. Petraso, the translator, had to choose how to render Jesus's likely pun, the choice to present Jesus as calling Peter the rock, and then building the church on this rock, creates an impression of identity between Peter and the church foundation that may not have existed in Jesus' original words. Whether thy Catholic Church misunderstood its own foundation isn't just an academic question. It's a challenge to the entire structure of papal authority if Jesus wasn't giving Peter special authority over other apostles, then Peter had no special authority to pass on to his successors, and if Peter never came to Rome, then the Bishop of Rome inherited no apostolic authority from Peter at all. Theological implications are staggering. The entire Catholic understanding of papal succession of the Pope as Peter's successor with supreme authority over all Christians depends on a specific interpretation of a passage that may reflect a translation error rather than historical fact. If the foundation is linguistic rather than divine, then 2,000 years of Catholic hierarchy might be built on sand rather than rock. To understand why the Catholic churches invested so much effort in proving that Peter died and was buried in Rome, we need to examine the political context in which this tradition developed, because the Peter tradition isn't just about honoring a saint, it's about establishing and maintaining the supremacy of the Roman Church over other Christian communities. In the early centuries of Christianity was no single center of Christian authority. Jerusalem had the prestige of being the city where Jesus died and rose again. Antioch could claim to be the first place where followers of Jesus were called Christians. Alexandria was the intellectual center of Christian theology. Rome was just one Christian community among many, with no particular claim to leadership, but Rome had one crucial advantage. It was the capital of the empire. As Christianity grew and spread throughout the Roman world, the practical advantages of having the Christian center coincide with the political center became obvious. The problem was theological. How could the Bishop of Rome claim authority over bishops in older, more prestigious Christian centers? The solution was the Peter tradition. If Peter had come to Rome, been martyred there, and passed his apostolic authority to the local bishop, then the Roman Church could claim not just practical supremacy, but divine mandate. The Bishop of Rome wasn't just another Christian leader, he was the heir to Thepasel, whom Jesus had designated as the rock of the church. But the tradition had to be more than just claimed, it had to be proven. This is where the importance of Peter's burial site becomes clear. A tomb wasn't just a memorial, it was evidence. If Peter's body could be located in Rome, then his presence there was undeniably. Magnificent churches could be built over his burial site, then Rome's special status would be literally set in stone. The imperial ambitions disguised as faith become apparent when we examine how the Peter tradition developed. Each generation of Roman bishops added details to the story, making it more specific and more grandiose. Peter wasn't just martyred in Rome. He was crucified upside down at his own request. He wasn't just buried in Rome, he was buried in a specific location that happened to be perfect for Constantine's Basilica construction project. The political need for Peter in Rome was so strong that it overcame historical skepticism. By the 4th century, questioning Peter's Roman presence had become not just historically questionable, but politically dangerous. Roman Church had too much invested in the tradition to allow it to bend by inconvenient facts. How the Bishop of Rome became the Popescent, a story of gradual recognition of existing authority. It's a story of successful political maneuvering disguised as theological development. The Peter tradition was the key to this transformation, providing divine sanction for what was essentially a power grab, one of the most closely guarded secrets revealed by the excavations. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica is the evidence of religious diversity among early Christians. The necropolis contains not just Orthodox Christian burials, but graves that reflect radically different understandings of what Christianity meant. Understandings that the victorious Roman Church spent centuries trying to eliminate from history. Among the Christian tombs beneath the Vatican, archaeologists found burial inscriptions that reflect Gnostic beliefs, Christian traditions that emphasize direct spiritual knowledge over institutional authority. These Gnostics believed that salvation came through enlightenment, rather than faith, and that the material world was a prison from which the spirit needed to escape. Their presence in the Vatican necropolis proves that these heretical Christians were part of the Roman Christian community from its earliest days. More troubling for official church history are the tombs that reflect what scholars call Jewish Christianity, Christian communities that continued to observe Jewish law and that saw Jesus as a great prophet rather than as God incarnate. These Christians rejected the divinity of Christ, the doctrine of the Trinity, and the authority of Paul the Apostle. There, graves marked with symbols that combined Jewish and Christian imagery demonstrate that the Christianity that developed in Rome included the later Orthodox Church would condemn as heretical. Gnostic texts that tell different stories weren't just theological curious, they represented entire Christian communities with their own bishops, their own scriptures, and their own understanding of what Jesus had taught. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered among the N.G. Hammadi texts in 1945, presents Jesus as a wisdom teacher whose sayings were designed to provoke spiritual insight rather than institutional loyalty. The Gospel of Philip describes Jesus as Mary to Mary Magdalene and presents her as his most important disciple. These Christianities weren't small fringe groups, they were major Christian movements that competed successfully with Orthodox Christianity. For centuries, the Maronite Church, which rejected the Hebrew Bible and taught that the Jewish God was evil, had bishops throughout the Roman Empire and may have outnumbered Orthodox Christians in some regions. The Christianities that Rome destroyed weren't eliminated through theological debate. They were suppressed through political power. Once Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine, Orthodox bishops had access to imperial authority to enforce theological conformity. Alternative Christian books were burned, alternative Christian bishops were exiled, alternative Christian communities where it is banded. What happened to the followers who disagreed? Many converted to Orthodox Christianity to avoid persecution. Others went underground, preserving their beliefs in secret communities that sometimes survived for centuries. Still others were absorbed into other religious movements or simply disappeared from the historical record. The evidence beneath St. Peter's Basilica of these alternative Christian travails, something that the Church has never acknowledged. The Christianity that eventually triumphed wasn't necessarily more true or more faithful to Jesus' teachings than the alternatives. It was simply more politically clear. Winners wrote the history, declaring themselves orthodox and their competitors heretical. But the presence of these alternative Christian graves in Vatican necropolis raises a troubling question. If the Christians buried beneath St. Peter's Basilica held beliefs that the later Church condemned as heretical, what does that tell us about the development of Christian orthodoxy? And if Christianity was diverse and contested from its earliest days, how can any single version claim to represent the original truth as we near the end of our forward journey through the mysteries beneath St. Peter's Basilica. We must confront the most troubling possibility of all, that St. Peter, as we know him, the first pope, the rock of the church, the martyred apostle buried beneath the Vatican, is not a historical figure, but a theological construction, a saint manufactured to meet the institutional needs of the Roman Church. The political need for Peter in Rome was overwhelming, that it may have led to the creation of an entirely fictional narrative. The Roman Church needed apostolic founding, so Peter became the founder of the Roman Church. It needed martyred sanctity, so Peter became a martyr in Rome. It needed a burial site that could serve as the center of Christian pilgrimage, so Peter was buried beneath what would become St. Peter's Basilica. Each element of the Peter tradition serves a specific institutional function. The stories of Peter's Roman ministry established the Church's apostolic credentials. The account of his martyrdom provided sacred drama and victim status. The location of his burial creates a pilgrimage destination and justifies the Vatican's central role in Christianity. But when we strip away the institutional needs and examine the historical evidence, what remains? A fisherman from Galilee who was one of Jesus' disciples, who may or may not have traveled widely after Jesus' death, and whose actual fate is unknown to history. Everything else, the Roman ministry, the inverted crucifixion, the burial beneath Vatican, appears to be later additions designed to serve the needs of the developing church. The process of manufacturing a saint wasn't unique to Peter. It was standard practice in the early church. Local Christian communities would identify burial sites of unknown individuals as belonging to apostles or martyrs, creating instant pilgrimage destinations and sources of religious authority. The stories would grow more elaborate, each telling until fiction became indistinguishable from fact. How faith becomes fact through repetition is demonstrated perfectly by the Peter tradition. What began as speculation about Peter's possible presence in Rome became a certainty about his definite martyrdom there. What started as hope that his remains might be found became conviction that they had been found. What originated as theological necessity became historical fact through the simple, expedient of constant repetition. The manufacturing process reveals something disturbing about the relationship between religious truth and historical accuracy. The Church's commitment to the Peter tradition isn't based on evidence, it's based on need. Peter must be buried beneath St. Peter's Basilica, not because the evidence admits it, but because the institutional structure of Catholicism requires it. Peter is a manufactured saint. What does that mean for the millions of Christians who have built their faith on the rock of his supposed authority? The question strikes at the heart of religious belief. Can faith survive the discovery that its historical foundations are human constructions rather than divine truths? We stand at the end of our investigation into the mysteries beneath St. Peter's Basilica. We find ourselves confront the same questions that have haunted Christianity for 2 millennia. Each generation of believers rediscovers these doubts, these inconsistencies, troubling gaps between faith and history, and each generation finds ways to bury them again, to choose belief over evidence, faith over fact. 1939 excavation beneath St. Peter's Basilica wasn't the first time these questions had been raised. Medieval scholars had questioned the Peter tradition. Renaissance historians had noted the lack of early evidence for Peter's Roman presence. Enlightenment critics had pointed out the contradictions in the traditional accounts, but each time the Church had found ways to deflect the criticism, to reinterpret evidence, to maintain the essential narrative even as the details shifted. Why does the truth remain perpetually buried? The answer lies In the recognition that some truths are too dangerous to acknowledge, the Catholic Church has built its authority structure on the claim that it inherits apostolic power from St. Peter to admit that Peter may never have come to Rome, that he certainly wasn't buried beneath the Vatican that the bones proclaimed as his relics are. Medieval fabrications, such admissions would undermine not just church history but church authority. The cycle of faith, doubt, and rediscovered mystery isn't accidentally structural. Each generation must choose between comfortable certainty and uncomfortably. Most choose certainty, allowing the mysteries to be buried again, beneficiaries of tradition, authority, and institutional pressure, but the questions won't stay buried forever. The empty tomb beneath the red wall remains empty. The bones proclaimed as Peter's remain scientifically questionable. The historical evidence for Peter's Roman presence remains thin. The archaeological record beneath St. Peter's Basilica continues to tell a story that contradicts the official narrative. For every generation that chooses to look, the evidence is there. The mystery isn't what happened to St. Peter, it's with a hand to the truth about St. Peter, and that mystery leads us to an even deeper question in a faith that claims to be founded on truth. What happens when the truth becomes the enemy? The perpetual return of these questions suggests something both troubling and hopeful about human nature. We cannot entirely suppress our need to know, our drive to understand, our refusal to accept comfortable lies in place of uncomfortable truths. Each generation produces its questioners, its investigators, its uncomfortable truth-tellers, and each generation must decide what to do with what they discover in the end. Perhaps what lies beneath St. Peter's Basilica isn't the body of a fisherman from Galilee. Perhaps what lies there is something far more powerful and far more human, our eternal need to believe that somewhere beneath all the mystery and contradiction, the truth is waiting to be found. The empty space where Peter's body should have been isn't just an absence, it's a presence. It's the presence of doubt, of questioning, of the human refusal to accept easy answers. Two difficult questions. The tomb that was never a tomb becomes a symbol of something more profound than any relic could ever be. The recognition that faith and truth sometimes stand in opposition to each other, and that choosing between them is the fundamental challenge of religious life. What if the greatest secret buried beneath the Vatican isn't what the Church has hidden, but what it has revealed? Not the presence of St. Peter, but the absence of certainty. Not proof of faith, but evidence of faith's fragility. Not the rock on which the Church was built, but the sand on which all human institutions ultimately rest. The Basilica above continues to welcome millions of pilgrims. Each year, people will come seeking connection with the sacred, with the eternal, with something greater than themselves. They kneel on marble floors, pray beneath soaring domes, and find in the beauty and mystery of the place something that speaks to their deepest spiritual needs. Does it matter that the bones beneath feet may not belong to St. Peter? Does it matter that the stories they've been told may not be historically accurate? Does it matter that the faith they've inherited may be built on human construction rather than divine revelation? Perhaps the answer depends on what we mean by truth. If truth is correspondence to historical fact, then the mysteries beneath St. Peter's Basilica are deeply troubling. But if truth is about meaning, about purpose, about the human capacity to create something beautiful and transformative from the raw materials of hope and need and aspiration, then perhaps the Peter tradition is true in ways that transcend historical accuracy. The fisherman from Galilee, who may never have come to Rome, has become something more powerful than any historical figure could ever be, a symbol of faith's possibility and faith's danger, of the human capacity to build magnificent structures on foundations of sand, of our eternal need to believe that somewhere in the darkness light is waiting to be found in the silence beneath. St. Peter's Basilica, in the empty space where certainty should be, perhaps we find something more honest than any definitive answer. The acknowledgement that mystery, not knowledge, lies at the heart of the human condition, and that sometimes, in the absence of answers, we discover questions worth spending a lifetime pursuing. The excavation beneath St. Peter's Basilica began with a simple goal to bury a pope and honor a saint. I tended with something far more complex, the discovery that truth itself might be the most elusive treasure of all, always just beyond our reach, always promising to reveal itself if we only dig a little deeper, always challenging us to choose between what we want to believe and what the evidence suggests we should believe, perhaps. That choice between comfortable faith and uncomfortable truth is there our secret. Buried beneath the Vatican, not an answer, but a question that each of us must resolve for ourselves. In a world where certainty is impossible, doubt is inevitable. How do we choose to live? What do we choose to believe in? What are we willing to sacrifice or risk in pursuit of truth, silence? Beneath St. Peter's Basilica continues waiting for each new generation to discover it, to wrestle with it, to make their own peace with the eternal questions that no amount of faith or archaeology can ever fully resolve. In that silence perhaps lies the most profound truth of all, that the human search for meaning is more important than any meaning we might find, and that the questions we ask reveal more about us than any answers we discover. The mystery endures, the search continues, and beneath the marble and gold of St. Peter's Basilica, in the darkness, where St. Peter may or may not rest, the eternal human drama plays on, the drama of faith seeking understanding, of hope confronting reality, of endless human quest to find in the midst of uncertainty something worthy of belief. What lies beneath the Vatican? Perhaps the answer is simpler and more profound than we ever imagined ourselves, reflected in the mirror of our deepest questions, discovering that the search for truth is itself the most human truth.